Okay, it sounds like we are ready to begin. So welcome to the 2021 Slave Dwelling Project Conference. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Aaron Treadwell. Dr. Treadwell is an assistant professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University, and we're excited to have him here to talk about building a fundamental archive for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a survey report on the digital AME Archives project. So without further ado, here is Dr. Treadwell.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And any good AME would know that protocol needs to be established. And so I do want to thank Joseph McGill and all of the board and planning committees for this conference, all leadership, all individuals who took the time out to be here to allow me to present this important research. I also would like to thank all of those aforementioned persons for having the forwardness to put forth a conference in which we can present our work safely with, can I say, the most comfortable accommodations I've ever had for a conference. And in fact, lecturing without a mask is also a plus in my book. And so I'm thankful for all of the planning that has been put forth and the amazing technology that we're able to use today. Of course, we are talking about archival work, and as the archivist for the African Methodist Episcopal Church history, I have been working on, as it's titled, a fundamental archive for this denomination. And so as I go forward, the question is, why me, right? And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but if I had 10 seconds to define myself, I would call or describe myself as a bivocational academic, in that I teach what I do and I do what I teach. And so alongside as an assistant professor at Middle Tennessee State, I'm also a senior pastor, and I'm ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But it goes far beyond just my own personal biases, right? My AME archival journey really begins 5 generations ago during and in the antebellum era. And it goes all the way back to my great-great-grandfather, Peter Blakely, who escaped from slavery at the age of 16 in South Carolina, who in the midst of his escape was taking up as what they described in the records as a contraband by Illinois Infantry Regiment. And often in that experience, he was able to ascertain connections and minimal wealth, but enough where he was able to purchase land, farm, and eventually a store in Rockford, Illinois. Long story cut short, by the time we get to 1891, Peter Blakely had noticed that there was no place in the city of Rockford, Illinois, for African Americans to worship. There was no place where African Americans could come together and convene and to fellowship and to feel safe, but also to plan and strategize against the racial segregation and oppression they were facing. So in 1891, Peter and Hattie Blakely, his wife, organized the Allen Chapel AME Church, which becomes the very first African American church in Rockford, Illinois. The meetings started in fact, his mother-in-law's house, Maria Donnelly. And ultimately, this church still is a staple for the Rockford, Illinois community, suburb north of Chicago. And you can see an image of Allen Chapel below on the screen. And so here is, of course, we're historians, right? So here is proof in terms of the vitalization, but also the importance of the act that would take place in not just Miss Donnelly's house, but the foresight for Peter Blakely to push for the establishment of a church. And so this comes to us out of the Christian Recorder, which is the oldest continuous African-American periodical to date. And it is the Christian Recorder is the organ or the paper for the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And this article comes to us in 1898 in the January 13 print. And it reads as so: as Rockford, where Reverend Samuel McDowell is pastor, the church is doing well. Colored people, most of whom have attended white churches, have at last, by the intricacies of this good man, come to the AME Church and ask for the district conference and Sunday school convention. And so we have from its genesis examples of African American people, as it reads on the top, creating tools to expose the evolution of social and civil resistance within American history. And that's what we're talking about today. When I talk to you about the need, the desire, and the purpose of this particular archival project, we're talking about a tool to show how African American people and Black people and African people utilize a methodology to resist. In fact, I just published a paper in the Journal of African American Studies, and I used the word theological protectionalism, in a sense, an idea that churches become a space to fight back against social as well as ideological oppression in America. Let's look at some of the historiography. Dennis Dickerson, current professor at Vanderbilt University and also previous historiographer for the AME Church, argues in his new publishing, which has come out this year in the Oxford Press, that the function of a Black church was to provide theological and social refuge. The Black churches, and specifically the AME churches, aren't just randomly selected places on a map that just people want to get to heaven quicker, and so they create a box or a building. No, the Black church, and specifically the AME Church, is a response to a theological and social need. A space where people need answers to esoteric questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? How do we deal with lynching? How do we deal with the taking away of suffrage rights? How do we deal with segregation, so on and so forth? Another great read, and another person that is paramount in the historiography, is Garrett Wilmore, and PhD, especially in his work, Black Religion and Black Radicalism. And according to Wilmore, the revitalization and revolutionary movements that developed in the Black community whenever an inveterate white racism backlash to check progress towards liberation, the Black church drew upon the resources of this distinctive religious orientation to interpret the meaning of Black experience and to strengthen the ability of the masses to face and deal with calamity. AKA, the Black church was a space in which people can understand what's going on, but it's also a space where people can plan to deal with it. And so when we talk about archiving, right, not just preserving, but organizing and structuring the evolution and the overall encompass of the AME Church worldwide, we're essentially creating a walking web tour of Black resistance in American history. We're tracking Black responses to social and civil arrest around the globe. People have a problem and need, you find a church popping up. People need voting rights, we see a church popping up. People need protection in the midst of the nadir of race relations, we see churches popping up. And if we can apply and ultimately organize, not just different institutions like the Underground Railroad that are arguably, controlled by a narrative that is predominantly white, if we can look at the own autonomy of Black persons and look at their trajectory and how they're organizing their own institutions and systems, and even through digital mapping, look at how those systems spread in a time manner, it will give us new insight in terms of how Black consciousness grows across, not, of course, worldwide, but specifically in these United States of America. So this is a particular abstract that we have that I put together for the archival project, and it reads, the African Methodist Episcopal Church is widely recognized for its impact on the social, political developments of Black liberation theology. However, many of the historical accomplishments of the AME Church are clandestine due to an institutional strategy of historical preservation. So my research has concluded that acts of clandestine social action by Black persons have had a negative correlation when measuring historical preservation, all in order to maintain anonymity. The practice of hiding history, something well recognized amongst African American researchers and researchers alike, have caused an evolutionary overlook in archival research, keeping specifically when teaching and preserving the history of the United States of America. These results can explain why the oldest Black connectional denomination in the world, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, lacks an archive that houses basic information like founding dates, pastors' names, and edifice dedications going all the way back to the Free African Society 1787. This is in contrast to the Underground Railroad experience and its many museums across America. Solving this issue must begin by creating a public and accessible digital archive that can analyze the foundational accomplishments and actors within the AME Church's 200-year history. By so doing, the act of Black resistance through theological protectionalism will begin to tell a new story, a story of Black political agency and a social consciousness that predates the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and the long civil rights movement within American history. And so what is it? Okay, so we're now looking at the inner weavings of this archival project. And if you look to your right, all of these pictures, I may take credit for them, even though it may not be the best angle. These are all photos that I've taken by myself, as well as other persons as we begin to compile digital media for the archival project. And this is an image that can be found in the basement of Mother Bethel AME Church, which is literally downtown in the old historic district of Philadelphia. Okay, so Mother Bethel is the initial church of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. And in fact, this is an original pulpit that you can find in their museum, which is in the basement. So if you have time and you're able to go to Philadelphia, visiting Mother Bethel is a must for all persons of interest. So the African Methodist Episcopal Digital Archive is essentially preserving a map of theological resistance, right? Our goal is to achieve and discover the geographic origins of congregation, number one. What does this mean? We want to know, why did this region need a church? What situations were in place in order for people to believe that this particular community needed to be led not just by an organization, but an organization that deemed it important to define themselves as African, right? And maybe even most importantly, what role does this church play as soon as it's established? Number two, we're archiving the genealogy of leadership. And so one of the things that we know going all the way back to W.E.B. Du Bois's Negro religion, when he talks about the role of first the medicine man, the spiritual leader, to the pastor in Black communities, is that the Black pastor often plays a very holistic role for the community. Usually he's the outlet, or he is the director of not just morality, but the desire for intellectualism, education, and drive, so on and so forth. And so we want to study the anthropological tendencies of leadership within these spaces that needed help. In an article that I just published talking about the Black church in response to lynching, we often find that it is the pastor from the pulpit that decides the trajectory taken by the church. Some pastors are very revolutionary, speaking of literally picking up a rifle for all members and shooting back. And then there are pastors that are very pious in invoking community prayers, but also guilt towards white racists who utilize false Christianity to justify lynching. So we want to look at not just the pastors who are serving there, and we need to have those records, but those who have available documents to also discover their anthropological tendencies. Number three, we want to look at the chronology of Black civil activism across the nation. So as was mentioned before in the thesis, the idea is that these churches are theological proclamations that Black bodies are imago Dei, made in the image of God, and therefore deserve protection. And so we're looking at the social achievement by these congregations as told through the archive. So again, overall, we are archiving the images, the stories, both told orally and recorded form, but also in written form, all cited, in order to preserve the strength of theological protectionalism, the argument that these churches made it their role to protect the temples, that is, the physical bodies of its members within the faith. And so let's talk about the creation process. We see here in Philadelphia a sign that represents the creation of the Free African Society in 1787. We'll get to in a moment. And so this is a public history project that most importantly reinforces self-advocacy for the lay. And if you're not familiar with the term lay identifies the participants or the persons who are not just members but work in the church. There have been some discrepancies at times. I consider pastors also a part of the lay in that they are workers of the church. But if you think of it in terms of the common language, typically they're members of the church who are workers. And so this is an approach that reinforces the training and also the opportunity for the members of this organization to be the voice of this production. This is ultimately a connected and housed project that is what I would call denominationally led, okay? The AME Church, let me just give y'all a run through. The AME Church is in ownership of America's oldest continued periodical, the Christian Recorder, as I previously noted. The AME Church is in the process right now of building a state-of-the-art publishing house in downtown Nashville that has been standing for a long time. And in addition, the AME Church Episcopal leadership of the historiography position that we're currently talking about. And in fact, its current person of leadership is Dr. Teresa Fry Brown. In fact, my advisor when I was at Emory, and is a qualified PhD historian, as were its previous leadership as well. AKA the AME Church is encouraged by its leadership, is proud of its leadership, and will always want not a, but the seat at the table when it comes to the telling of its story. So it was paramount in this project that not only would AMEs have a seat, but would have the seat at the table, and they could make sure that their voice was heard all the way to the top, as the Episcopal historiographer would like to make sure that the history is being preserved in appropriate form that the church denomination agrees with. It's also going to be a collection process that is connected to the connectional conference structure. So if you know anything about Methodism, you know that Methodists love to have conference, and AMEs may love conferences the most because it seems like they have one every month. And ultimately, very similar to a democratic government, you have different Episcopal conferences, and inside those conferences, you have different districts and then regional conferences, so on and so forth. It's very systematic. So one of the beauties of this particular project is that it has also teamed up with the 20 bishops, the 20 leaders of the denomination that ultimately has provided a self-autonomy in which these particular presentations and historical preservation trainings are taking place in very micro manner to different organizations across the world in a very systematic and structured way. Fourth point on the screen, we see these congregations appreciate the training, but not the taking. Right? So again, and I think I've reiterated a few times, congregants want to be trained. One of the major movements that we've seen in the last 20 years is that the leadership of the African Methodist Episcopal Church are pushing for every single congregation, every single church to have their own lay historiographer. Okay, so one of the miscues that I often see with some colleagues is that they want to go to a church and study, And the first thing they do is that they go to a pastor, right? But one of the things that I've learned, and I've pastored 3 AME churches, is that typically I know less than some of the older members have forgotten, right? So the reality is there's a situation where it's typically the senior members of the church that are given these historiographer positions, and they sincerely appreciate the training and the opportunity to participate in this research. But what they don't want is the taking. They don't want someone to come in and take their history and not only not involve them in the process, but not have their name on it. And so as the archivist of this project and the assistant to the historiographer of the denomination, I am providing training opportunities, not just to congregations, but I have been so blessed by Middle Tennessee State University to allow the incorporation of this project for history majors in, for example, our senior seminar, also graduate students, both those who are my graduate assistants, but also in different classes through graduate study. And then ultimately providing them the training and the ability to understand how to conduct interviews, organize the data upon receiving it, teaching them how to utilize not just not just Excel, but teaching them the SQL language. And so we can input this document into the online, the database, and ultimately understanding how archival input projects work. Now, one of the key pieces of the thesis that I had mentioned is this idea of hiding history. And so one of the pieces that we have found in this project is that all of the history of the church, just like slavery, right, in terms of this particular conference, not all the information has been shared. Many of it has been syncretic or kind of mixed, and so sometimes goes overlooked by the untrained eye. But some of it is literally hidden due to the fear of reparation and dangers of speaking radically or against powerful systems. Who can forget that Denmark Vesey was an assistant minister of Morris Brown's church in Charleston, South Carolina in the antebellum era that is now known of as Emmanuel Church or Mother Emmanuel. When Denmark Vesey was caught, Morris Brown would flee to Pennsylvania, where he would become the 3rd bishop of the AME Church, but that congregation will be burned. Well, let's fast forward 200 years, and unfortunately, in 2015, we have the event of the Emmanuel 9, which also takes place, coincidentally, in the same as that congregation, Mother Emmanuel, where 9 individuals are shot during Bible study due to the pastor's concept of liberation and theology. If you look at this picture to the right, it's very interesting in that this is also in the basement of Mother Bethel in their museum, helped cultivated as of recently by Pastor Mark Tyler. And if you look all the way to the right, you could actually see the tomb of Richard Allen where he lies to this day. But if you look to the right, you see something interesting. And we have the images of Sarah Allen and Richard Allen, the founders of the denomination. We have to the right, ultimately, the image of both St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the church that Richard Allen would walk out of in protest, but also to the right of that, the blacksmith shop, where ultimately Mother Bethel would be housed in its first sanctuary. And then all the way to the right, a more common edifice of Mother Bethel. But does anyone, well, I guess this is not a talk back, but behind this wall, there's something very special there. And behind this wall is literally a storage space that was used to hide enslaved people in the Underground Railroad. So this idea of even what meets the eye can often be overlooked, that even in the very first AME denomination, it was made sure of that there was a space inside of the church to hide slaves. Let's look at these 2 last quotes and I'll go forward because, the biggest lie in American history is a Black minister telling you they'll be short. So let me hurry up. Henry McNeil Turner, who not only is one of the notable Black bishops in American history, but also one of the more prominent church growth and development persons in world history. And Henry McNeil Turner, in The Voice of Missions, articles that were connected with the AME Church in 1897, argued, and I quote, "Negroes should defend themselves with guns against the lynch mob. Blacks should acquire guns and keep them loaded and ready for immediate use. His views might be considered an unseemly departure for a man of God, that he had held his tongue for many years out of concern for the religious organizations he represented. But after the latest lynchings, he was now urging, 'Get your guns, Negroes. Get your guns, and my God will give you good aim when you shoot.'" Let's also go to Perry Carson in 1898 as he preached from a North Carolina pulpit in response to different Klan activity in the area. "Blacks must prepare to protect yourselves. The virtues of your women and your property. Get your powder and your shot and your pistol." Now, these are particular sermons in the midst of the Native race relations, a time where over 4,000 African people would be lynched. That doesn't include African people who were killed on one-on-ones, but public executions over 4,000. And yet these pastors were willing and bold enough to say it. But what doesn't happen is the mass submission of these thoughts, because they're dangerous. When you speak like this, when you preach like this, pulpits get burned down. Threats get sent to your congregation. It's dangerous to be connected with these particular teachings. And so many individuals, many sermons, many ideas as such have been hidden. But just because they were hidden to the public eye does not mean that they weren't being preached. It does not mean that the churches were not taking roles. And so my goal is not necessarily to print every single sermon that has ever been preached, because that's impossible. But what is possible is to at least lay out the pathway in terms of how these churches have been planted, how seeds of theology have been taught throughout the history of the United States of America, and specifically from that, giving historians like you, like me, an opportunity to understand how relevant, prevalent, and systematized African American resistance has been in the entire existence of Black culture here in America. On the right, I have a simple screenshot, and it is publicly accessible now. So I guess they say get in while the getting's good. You can actually go to these websites you see on your screen. And in fact, you can go through the website. It is, of course, in development, but you can click on the database tab and receive a glimpse ultimately of how the archive is coming together. If you look to the right side of your screen, we'll see that from the simple browsing option, there is an ability to search your church by name, state, city, Episcopal district. The AME Church is broken down in 20 of them, the conference within that district, the district within that conference, the address, and if you scroll to the right, which I couldn't for the screenshot, you can also look at the date in which the edifice was founded. And then if you see each church, it is hyperlinked. And so the amazing work of lay persons as well as undergraduate and graduate students are putting together factually checked and cited histories for each and every church. And ultimately, it will go onto these hyperlinks in which researchers and lay persons alike can simply look up a church and find its brief history and the tellings of its tradition. My name again is Aaron Treadwell. This is a lifetime project for me, so I look forward to each and every person who not only shows interest, but a willingness to celebrate and assist this project, the African Methodist Episcopal Church Digital Archives. Thank you for your time. Yeah, say there's not time for questions and answers, and so I don't know necessarily how that will work, but I'll let those in play assist me.
Hey, yes, if y'all have any questions and you want to put them in the chat, I can put them on the screen so Dr. Treadwell can see them. So.
All right, so I guess I'll just read them. So, Teresa, that is outstanding. And one of the things, again, that we're trying to do is to create a consciousness, not just of the need of historical preservation, but letting people know that there is room for them in this storytelling. I know often I have met individuals without commas and degrees behind their name that could simply talk circles around me when it came to some of the history of their areas. And so I think ultimately this is a project, of course, that is going to be of academic quality, but also an opportunity for all people to really get a physical feel of what it means to see resistance travel along. In terms of Lovely Lane Archives in Baltimore and its relation, Marlena, to the AME Church, I am sure that ultimately, if there is a way to get connected, you could surely reach out to me in the email, and I'll see how I can put that together. I had the opportunity to serve as assistant pastor in Metropolitan AME Church, which is just a few blocks away from the White House. And ultimately, I did have some great times in Baltimore. So I'm sure there's some very close relations there as well. And also, arguably, many people would say that Baltimore houses one of the earliest waves, the first wave of AME development, as the AME Church was simultaneously developing in Baltimore. So thank you. Any other questions? Well, again, thank you very much. If you do have any questions that may have, slipped out of your mind, you can definitely find my contact information, not just, of course, on MTSU's website, but as well on the AME Archives website as well. Thank you. Take care.